Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here for this event with Cyntoia Brown-Long. My name is Molly Gould, and I'm a sophomore studying international relations, and I'm currently a Laidlaw Scholar. I became involved with Cyntoia's story through my research on criminal justice reform last summer. I've been inspired by her story and her memoir, and I'm sure you will be too. I am so happy that she will be joining us this evening. Before I introduce Alan Solomont, Dean of Tisch College of Civic Life, to introduce our guest, I'm excited to start off tonight's program with a brand new video in celebration of Tisch College's 20th anniversary this year. As you watch this short video, you may recognize fellow members of the Tufts community gathered together to bring about positive social change, whether through protests, at the voting booth, or in public discussion on critical topics like tonight's forum with Cyntoia Brown-Long. So let's take a look. Thank you so much for being part of tonight's conversation, and please welcome Dean Alan Solomont.
Well, thanks, Molly, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's screen showing. To this evening's Tisch College Distinguished Speaker Series, featuring a conversation with Cyntoia Brown-Long, an author and activist for criminal justice reform. I want to thank Molly Gould, who you just heard from. It was her suggestion that we bring Cyntoia to campus. She was also instrumental in developing the program for Cyntoia's visit and for tonight's event. So thank you, Molly. I also want to thank Jess Burns and all of my Tisch College colleagues for their work on this forum and on so many other events throughout the year. I'd like to acknowledge more than a dozen co-sponsors of tonight's event. There are really too many to name individually, but I hope you saw them recognized on the screen before we started. It's gratifying that so many organizations from across the university joined us to support this event. It demonstrates the concern and commitment of so many students, faculty, and staff to the issues we'll discuss with tonight's guest. We understand these are challenging topics that touch on difficult personal experiences. I want to encourage you to support each other and to seek support from offices like CARE and others at Tufts who are well prepared and committed to dealing with these issues. As you saw in the introductory video, we are celebrating Tisch College's 20th anniversary. Tisch was founded in 2000 with the purpose of advancing Tufts University's commitment to civic life. Our mission, then and now, is to ensure that all Tufts students across all schools and academic disciplines acquire the knowledge, the skills, and the values to become leaders and problem solvers in their communities near and far. Tisch College began with a single student program, now known as the Tisch Scholars. Are there any Tisch Scholars here tonight? Let's give them a shout out. Today we offer and support dozens of initiatives for students in and out of the classroom, on campus and around the world. We also are home to a nationally recognized research center that studies youth voting, civic education, and other aspects of civic and democratic life. And our community partnerships, always a central element of our work, have evolved and expanded to encompass more communities and broader impact. The Distinguished Speaker Series began 7 years ago with a visit by Senator Elizabeth Warren. Just a bit of irony today. Today, other Tisch College events have grown to match the breadth. I didn't mean that, and it was a treat to have Senator Warren. We were honored to host her here. But today, other Tisch College events have grown to match the breadth and scope of our work. We're excited about this year's lineup of visitors and guest speakers. Yesterday, we hosted a lunch about the Black Power movement with Professor Rhonda Williams. And later this year, we will host Congressman Joe Kennedy, Congressman Eric Swalwell to talk about impeachment, veteran journalist Chris Wallace, political strategist Scott Jennings, and many other scholars and leaders whose work will inform our views, challenge some of our beliefs, and encourage our participation in civic life. With this diversity of speakers, we want to highlight different ways by which people can impact issues they care about and help build a more just and equitable world. Tonight's guest personifies that idea and reminds us that from humble beginnings, far outside the halls of power, all of us can learn from our lived experiences and use them to become a force for change. Cyntoia Brown-Long is an author, activist, and advocate for criminal justice reform and for victims of human trafficking. She was born to a young mother who struggled with alcohol abuse and who was a victim of sex trafficking. As a teenager, Cyntoia became a victim of trafficking herself, and at 16, she was arrested for killing a man who solicited her for sex. Cyntoia was tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her trafficker was never arrested. In prison, Cyntoia experienced a profound personal and spiritual transformation. A documentary called Me Facing Life, Cyntoia's Story, chronicled her experiences. And as a result, many celebrities, clergy, and other influential people began advocating on her behalf. The hashtag #FreeCyntoia went viral. And eventually, her sentence was commuted by then-Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee. On August of last year, after 15 years behind bars, Cyntoia was released from prison. Since then, Cyntoia has become a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform, especially for women and children in American prisons. She published a memoir, Free Cyntoia, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, which she wrote while she was incarcerated. She and her husband, Jamie, founded the Foundation for Justice, Freedom, and Mercy, and in January of this year, the Vera Institute of Justice recognized Cyntoia as one of the best of justice reform honorees. She was also a 2020 nominee for the NAACP Literary Image Award. Joining our guests on stage tonight is Professor Hilary Binda, a Tisch College Senior Fellow and the founding director of the Tufts University Prison Initiative at Tisch College. I mentioned earlier that Tisch College has expanded the scope of its educational programs, and TUPIT is one of our newer initiatives that we are especially proud of. Hilary manages the college degree program at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord, which is a partnership between Tufts University and Bunker Hill Community College to award an associate degree to a group of incarcerated men in the program. As part of the prison initiative, Hilary also runs an inside-outside course at the Maximum Security Prison in Shirley, Massachusetts, through which Tufts students and incarcerated individuals take a course together. Hilary's current research is in the field of higher education and incarceration. She is a senior lecturer at Tufts with a PhD in English, and she also directs the program in women's, gender, and sexuality studies. Hilary is a strong advocate for the importance of bringing higher education into prison, and we're grateful that she joins us tonight in conversation with our guests. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hilary Binda and our distinguished speaker, Cyntoia Brown-Long.
Cyntoia, I want to start by just thanking you again. It's such an honor to be here with you. It's such an honor to have you at Tufts. And it's a first visit. I hope it's the first of many. I also want to thank you for your beautiful book, for sharing your journey with us and educating us on issues of the criminal justice system, on your particular journey, and on your faith and on faith. So I think for people who haven't maybe yet read Cyntoia's book, I want to start by acknowledging how recently you are free. August, right?
August 7th,
For August
3:18.
3:18 in the morning?
Yep.
So I'm wondering if you want to share with us a kind of first, that all of the firsts that you get to experience, like a first meal or something.
Well, everything is pretty much a first nowadays. But my first meal, I actually talked about in the book, was a can of ravioli.
How was that?
I mean, at 3:18 in the morning, it was great.
Okay,
So,
good. So before we start in talking about your story, I wanted to ask you if you could reflect on what it's been like telling your story. And I can only imagine that going over some of the really difficult details can be hard, or maybe also very helpful in ways.
it's definitely been a blessing to be able to sit and talk about my story and what I went through. Coming from my background, I find that a lot of us don't have a voice. Our voices are stripped away, our experiences, they don't count. So to have the opportunity to sit and talk about that is just incredible. To tell everyone, you know, my testimony, what God did for me, each and every time is just a blessing.
You talk at one point in the book about about your various trials and being a kind of battle of narratives, not really about who's telling the truth, but who's telling the better story. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there's a way that you're kind of getting the final word here and shaping your story.
Well, God definitely always has the last say.
Okay, okay, fair.
I've come to find that out. You know, a lot of times when you're in the court system, you think, well, if I just explain this and let them know what happened, this is what's going to take place. If I just present this case law to this court, they're going to rule in my favor. But that's not what happens. What happens is whoever can spin the best narrative, whoever can, you know, put on the best performance in the courtroom, that's who ends up winning, and 9 times out of 10 it's going to be the prosecution. So that was a very, very, very hard hurdle to overcome. But like I said, I thank God I serve a God who always has the last say.
So one of the things that you do so powerfully in the book is convey the sense of yourself as a child, particularly in the earlier part of the book, and as a teenager, as someone who was loved and loving and searching for love and independence, just like all teenagers do. That's their job. And you also talk about ways that you were repeatedly victimized and how long it took you. I think until 2017, 10 years into your sentence, you still hadn't really identified what your experiences were as victimization and as being a victim of trafficking rather than the teen prostitute that the media was presenting you as. I wonder if you can talk about why you think it took so long for you, for so many women, I imagine, who experienced that horrible reality.
Right. So you always hear this saying, you know, about people who've had their childhood taken away from them. And I don't think we really understand what that means. For me, my experience, it was that there were several adults that I was around who were putting me in the position of being adult. And I was a child. So I had grown women who were teaching me that my body was a commodity. It was a means to get things from men, and it was completely acceptable to expect things in return for my companionship, for sex, and things of that nature. I was told that my entire existence revolved around pleasing a man in some form. I was 13 when they started teaching me these things. And that is really what started me on the trajectory to being more vulnerable to being exploited. I was told that these things were normal, so my worldview had been reshaped to think that, well, this is how relationships work. This is how relationships between men and girls, which, you know, I was still a girl, I wasn't a woman, but that's how this goes. So by the time I met a man who convinced me that we were in a relationship, and part of this relationship meant that I would go out and have sex with men for money and bring it back to him, I thought that was completely normal. The society that I was in at that point didn't call me a sex trafficking victim. I was called a teen prostitute. I was made to believe that these were my choices. They were made, you know, of my own volition. And there was never any conversation about the adults that had taught me these things, the worldview that had been skewed to convince me to do these things, not from the people that I was around, not from the court system. And it took a long time for that understanding to just like really be reshaped. We still have a lot of work now. I can't tell you just how many times I was told that I was fast and that I was just hot instead of the fact that I was a child who was being misled.
And sometimes having a gun held to your head. And, the media portrayal of you through those early years and well into your incarceration was pretty horrific. Do you have a sense of how the media might handle the situation better? It sounds like you do, but how have things gotten better since then in the last 15 years or so, 10 years, do you think? Or
in my particular case, they've definitely shifted. When I was first arrested, you know, I was painted as this horrible monster. The media referred to me as a teen prostitute, and I was just painted as just this filthy, dangerous individual. And obviously now things have changed. I still see some media referring to certain cases of child prostitution. There's no such thing as child prostitution. It's sexual exploitation. And, you know, it's changing, but there's still work that needs to be done. In terms of the criminal justice aspect of it, I don't see much that has changed. Me personally, it's changed, but I see a lot of times, especially with young kids, their pictures are posted up on the news. They're painted as this horrible individual. They're not talked about the kids that they are, maybe some of the circumstances that they may have been involved in at the time. There's always just this rush to judgment, this rush to try people by the media, and I think that's unfortunate, especially since we live in a country where you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty.
Right, right. So one of the things we expect is that once, or I'm not sure any of us in this room expect it at this point, but in theory, one is incarcerated or enters into the system and the rehabilitation begins.
Sounds good.
I wonder if you could talk about the reality and sort of the re-traumatizing effect of getting caught in the web of the system, and whether there are specific ways that impacted your sense of yourself, your efficacy.
Well, the reality is what I and many of the women that I was incarcerated with experienced was that from the time that we stepped foot into a facility, we were just treated as we were there to be warehoused. We were there to be warehoused, put under some kind of strict control. Rules changed every single day. The only time our rehabilitation was an issue was when there was a federal grant at stake, was when there was some kind of funding that was going to come in, but as part of receiving that funding, there had to be certain programs in place. And even then, it was just however much was necessary to get by to comply with whatever standards that they had set for that grant. We definitely need to work more on treating people from the time that they walk into that door as we need to be focused on how do we get them to the other side of this? How can we help them to become their best selves? What can we do to make sure that this person has a successful reentry into society?
As you talked about the process of going through the multiple trials and preparations for various trials, You also described lawyers you were working with, like Rich, who was really on your side and trying to help, but even in that case, didn't want you to tell your story and was essentially silencing you. That really struck me, that it's really not personal. There is something just systemic about entering the system and being kind of obliterated.
Right. The entire nature of the court proceeding, the trial proceedings, they're so adversarial, and it's all about strategy, and it's all about, taking, this is what they have, and this is how we're going to spin it. And yes, I understand that this is what your truth is, this is what happened with you, but it just doesn't sound good. And so we're just going to go with this. And it doesn't only happen with the defendants, it happens a lot with the victims. So you have victims who go through this process, and at the end, they think that they're going to get some sort of closure, some sense of justice, and they're left just as lost as the defendants in the case. There's no real restoration, no real rebuilding of what has been broken.
Yours is so much a story of incredible survival, really thriving against these all odds, and I'm wondering if we can turn to some of the more positive things that happened actually once you were in the system. Specifically thinking about your college experience. I was telling you earlier, it was very moving for me, and I think many of us who are involved in that work at Tufts, to hear you talk about what the role of the Lipscomb University program was in your life. Can you share some of that, and the students, what the role of meeting those students was like?
Absolutely.
That was an inside-out class or program,
right.
Generally. Yeah. So you were working with a lot of university students.
Mm-hmm. With Lipscomb, they call it. It's part of their SALT curriculum, which is serving and learning together. And so it's the LIFE program, the Lipscomb Initiative for Education. And I was 4 years into serving my sentence when the opportunity presented itself for me to be part of the program. Had to jump through a lot of hurdles, but by the grace of God, I got in it. And I was expecting, okay, I'm going to further my education. I'm going to get something that's going to look good when I go before the court or when I go before, the governor, and it's going to look really good on paper. But once I got into the class, what I realized is I had been welcomed into a community. I was in a place where all throughout my early life, in public school, in my own community, I had always been made to feel like I was an outcast. I had always been made to feel that because of things that I had gone through or because of things that I had done, I was just written off. I was no good. The court process, that just amplified that. So for me to just be welcomed into this community of people who, they didn't see any of that. They just saw me, and they loved me. That was redeeming beyond anything that I had ever experienced. They saw something in me that was worth salvaging. They saw something in me that was worth investing in, and it helped me to believe in myself. And I started excelling in everything that I put my mind to. I ended up getting a 4.0 in every single class.
Wow. Wow. Amazing.
And prior to being in that program, the highest level of education that I completed in school was 7th grade. So,
wow. What do you think? What do you think the students? I mean, you talked about being accepted. What were those interactions like? I don't know if there's a specific example of a moment where a student treated you a certain way.
So the university itself, how do I put this? It's a university where there's a lot of affluent people who send their children there. So a lot of these kids come from very privileged backgrounds. Their experience, although they were the same age as me in the early stages, completely different from my own. And you go into it thinking that you're going to expect one thing, but what I found is, wow, we have more in common than I had ever thought. And it was really cool to be able to sit and have these conversations with them and to see that they were interested in learning about what life was from my perspective. They were interested in seeing, how can they be more respectful of my experiences? How can they be, more helpful of changing the prison system, the justice system. And whenever they walked out of there, they left knowing, wow, this could happen to me too. Mm-hmm. And so they were that much more invested to actually try to change things.
Do you see, as a result of that experience, or do you see a role for education in your future?
I've thought about law school. It's pretty much just a matter of when will I have time for it. Yeah. I really enjoy coming out and speaking with people. Mm-hmm. So it's just, setting aside time to do that. But I absolutely love education. Very, very rewarding.
And we'll talk in a few minutes about all the work you already are doing, and you are educating already. Yeah. So, yeah. So I wanted to ask you also about the really powerful role, as you created in the book, that your mom, your adoptive mom, played in your life and in your journey. And I wonder if you could talk about that. How was she part of it with you?
So my mother adopted me when I was just 8 months old. So she, the only mother I had ever known, had always fought to really just give me the life that any mom would want to give her child. Even when I struggled, she was always there trying to figure out, how can I help? When the school would call her up, she'd be like, well, what can I do? Obviously, they gave her no answers that were helpful, but she tried. She tried very hard, and she was there. So when I was arrested and I saw that all the people that I was hanging around, they were teaching me all of these things that no 13-year-old girl ever should learn, they were nowhere to be found. The only person that was left standing there was my mother. And she had been my best friend from that moment. She came to visit me every other week in prison. We're still close, her and my husband. Were the closest things to me.
In fact, she got to know your husband before you were out. Is that?
Oh, they became best friends. Yeah.
Where is he? I was very struck by how you never, it's just a teenager's job to blame their mother for, mm-hmm. I can tell you this from personal experience, for everything that goes wrong in their life that the mother may not even know about. And you just, at least at this point, and as you wrote the book, just have such a loving relationship with your mom. And, there was a very powerful moment where you talk about the plexiglass when you got sent to the max and the visits had to be behind plexiglass. Yeah. And you felt not angry, but guilty. I don't know, that was, you were an incredible child, and you're an incredible person.
I wasn't always the best child. I will say that. And, I went through a lot of those same feelings. I think everybody, when they're a teenager, you feel like your parents, they don't understand what life is like. They were, I thought my mom was ancient. She couldn't understand what life in school was like for me. When I told her the things, that I was going through, I felt like she really wasn't listening to what I was saying, so I stopped telling her things. Mm-hmm. I started keeping things from her. So she really couldn't be there for me in the ways that she needed to be as, my parent, as that positive role model in my life. Mm. So I definitely spent some time of my life pushing her away, okay. But it was that time when I was there sitting in jail and had done everything, under the sun to try to push myself further away from my mother, but there she was still standing, and she was the one that was there for me. Mm. That made me realize that, wow, I got this wrong. Mm.
So. Well, is it fair to say that not all women in serving time have a person like that in their life?
That's very fair. A lot of people in prison, they go, and if they do have any family, if they do have children, it's very hard to maintain a relationship. You pretty much live a relationship over global telling, over a paid phone call when you can afford it, and it's timed, and it's a hassle to get to it. It's very hard to parent or play a role in your family over a telephone, and that's a lot of people's experience. It's very hard for a lot of families to afford to drive up to the prison, and that's if you don't get hassled and somehow get your visitation privileges restricted by the administration. So there are a lot of barriers that serve to pretty much break up families. when it comes to the prison system. So many women don't have, you know, that their mother there, especially as long as she was there for me.
In Massachusetts, they just decreased the number of visitors you can have.
Of course they did.
So,
Yeah.
I am wondering if you would share a little bit. I will say that just working in prison for the last 7 years or so has brought me to questions of faith like nothing else in my life has up to this point. And I know that that's been an enormous part of your journey. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk about the role of faith in your journey.
So I was actually speaking with a group of students earlier, and I was asked that same question. And, you know, I'll tell you guys, just like I told them, faith is the only reason that I'm sitting here with y'all today. I had tried everything when I was trying to get out of prison. I had put my faith in, you know, case law and my attorneys, which I had 7 of them, and very experienced attorneys. And each time that failed. And I looked back and I said, wow, every time I put my faith in man, like I get failed. And I met my husband who told me, you know, God said you're getting out of prison. This was a time when all of my appeals had been denied. And he said, are you going to trust what man says? Or are you going to trust what God says? And I said, you know what? I'm going to try trusting what God says. He introduced me to Jesus. And I say introduced me because although I had been told about Jesus, I had been told about someone who died on the cross for my sins, and if I believed in him, I would have eternal life. I never really knew him. I never really got to know him. I never knew what having a relationship with him meant. Never really understood his own journey as he went through on, you know, his life here on the earth. And really got to know him through a whole different perspective, and it changed everything. Having a relationship with him was completely different than anything that I had ever been told in my earlier life, growing up in the Baptist church, about faith. And so I say that that's when my faith was truly born, and it changed everything.
Thank you. Lipscomb is a Christian university? Is that
It is.
right? Yeah.
And what's interesting is when I first joined Lipscomb, although it's a Christian university, I was completely resistant to any talk about God. I was so angry at that point because I had spent so much time praying that God free me from prison, and I saw that I was still sitting in there. I had prayed that I not be given life in prison, but I was given life in prison. I prayed that I not be tried as an adult, but I was tried as an adult. So I said, you know what, God's not real. This is not real. There's no one who's listening to me. And I went around and I told that to anyone who would listen, that God wasn't real. But I was proven wrong. And I saw that just because we think things are supposed to go in a certain way, just because the things that we see don't line up, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a plan. He always has a plan. He has a plan for each and every one of our lives. We can't see where it's leading us, but I promise you, he plans for our good. His will for our lives is good, and he made a believer out of me.
You talk at one point about seeing God as community. Is that something you could talk about a little? I don't know if you still feel that way.
Oh, yeah. So when this is a journey. And so when I talk about, my faith, and now, you can't tell me nothing about Jesus. But it hasn't always been that way. And so, I went through this long searching process and thinking, okay, well, this must be what this is, and this must explain this. But when I really got into the program of Lipscomb, and this was a community of believers, this was the first time that I had really had an interaction with people who professed to believe in Jesus, where my experience was completely different. They looked at me, how Jesus walked around and looked at people, how Jesus would sit around with people who were considered to be the lowest of the low, and that's who he came and he wanted to have dinner with. That's who he came and he wanted to talk with, because he said that you're no different than this guy over here. I love you just the same. And they treated me that way. It was a completely different experience to see that, no, wow, I do belong to a community. I'm not an outcast. I'm not, someone that just to be thrown away. And that was powerful.
So you kind of alluded to this earlier, but it seems like your personal growth, your relationship to love, particularly romantic love, and your relationship to your faith and to God were all kind of intertwined. And there's a moment in the book where you describe something that your husband Jamie said, and you describe it as the sexiest thing he ever said, was, "Don't revere me. Don't put me on a pedestal. Yeah. It's not me who should be on a pedestal." And it's a very different version of love than what you'd experienced as a child. Can you talk about that sort of intertwining of love and God?
Yeah, so, as I was speaking earlier about how I was told, everything about my existence should revolve around pleasing a man. And the men that I was introduced to, like I was supposed to put them and their needs on this pedestal. And, I was always taught, like, that's what I was supposed to do as a woman. And then I meet Jamie, and he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, that's not what this is. You don't live for me. You don't live your life for me. You live your life for Christ. And I was like, wow. Like, that's completely different. And he showed me the difference between being with someone who is led by their own ambitions, who's led by, how they feel they should treat other people, and being with someone who's led by their love for Christ. It's completely different. And that's what really showed me, God put this man in my life. God is who sent me him. All this time I was looking for a man. I was looking for my own ideas about what relationships was. But he's the one that sent me the person that he created for me. And it's completely different than anything that I had ever encountered. So now I get to spend my days with my best friend, with my partner. And he's my husband. He's everything, He's awesome.
He's here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing now. So you did a lot of work as you sort of, in some senses, found your freedom before you were released and even knew you were going to be freed. You started working on juvenile sentencing laws. I think you worked on a reform bill in Tennessee that hadn't passed the first time, but maybe continue working on that. Redesigning juvenile facilities, really thinking about different protocols for how to work with juveniles who get caught in the system. You also talked about your capstone project for the Lipscomb experience as developing glitter, suddenly I'm forgetting the first word.
Grassroots Learning Initiative on Teen Trafficking, Exploitation, and Rape.
Did you hear that? Okay. Yeah. I'm wondering if you could talk about, and you've talked tonight about the importance of your speaking and sort of how you see your role as an advocate, as an activist in the world going forward. Granted, it's just been a few months, and I'm sure things will continue to shift, but you're already so involved.
Well, like you said, that began while I was still in prison. So when I joined the college program, which is the LIFE program, the Lipscomb Initiative for Education, they helped me to understand that just because I was told I was given life in prison, that didn't mean that my life was over. And I could still choose how I was going to live that life. And for me, I wanted my life to have meaning. I didn't want to just lay there and just be done. So when I saw that there was things that needed to be changed, I didn't want to sit in the classroom and just be talking. I didn't want to say, well, this isn't right with the system, and this should be this way. I wanted to see what I could do about it. And that's what I started doing. So I started having conversations with people, and next thing you know, I'm sitting in the prison visitation area with the state representative talking about a bill that he's going to present on my behalf to change the sentencing laws of juveniles. Now I live in Tennessee, very conservative state, not very keen on reform. So it has yet to pass. I just testified in the Senate there in my state about the bill. So we're still working. That's been 5 years in the making. But just so many opportunities like that to design, redesign the juvenile facility for Davidson County has yet to be built, will be being built soon. But really just being able to put myself out there, feeling empowered that, you know, I have a voice and my experience matters. What I have to say matters. Like, I can have a seat at the table too. And, you know, it's made all the difference. So.
Thank you for all that work. I have many more questions, and was just signaled that that was our last. So I'm gonna open it up now to the audience. We have, I'm gonna ask people to be sure you're asking a question, not repeat questions, be concise. And we have mics, so if you would just raise your hand, we'll have a mic brought to you.
First, thank you for coming here. It's wonderful, all you've done. And I would like to ask, you have gone through quite a transformation that happened. Was there help along the way to address what that would look like? Did you have spiritual advice? Was it just something that happened without it? How did that understanding come about?
The understanding of what now?
The understanding, well, it's an understanding of God for you.
So that's really a good question. I had my own encounters. I had my encounters with God, didn't know what it was. I wrote about it in the book about these dreams I started having, prophetic dreams, where I dreamed something and then it would happen. And I couldn't explain that with, you know, my usual explanations that this isn't real, this doesn't exist, and there's nothing going on here. So like I had to spend a lot of time thinking, wow, wait a minute. And that really just sort of planted a seed. So a lot of seeds were planted, but I had to go through a lot. God had to take me through a lot of different processes for those seeds to bloom. And he sent my husband along to water it. And, you know, that really helped my faith to be born. But it was definitely a long process, long drawn out process. And we all have our own journeys. You know, we all go through phases where we may be trying to figure out, you know, who is he? Who is God? Is God real? And some of us struggle with being angry. I struggled with being angry. But he definitely has a plan. And when I had that opportunity to just sit and be still and really focus and put my eyes on him, he'll speak to you. He spoke to me, he'll speak to you too. And you'll know his voice.
Is it on? Yes.
Hi. So firstly, thank you for sharing your story and for the transformational work you're doing and for the ways that this is shaping the Tufts community tonight. As briefly introduced before, the Tufts Prison Initiative is offering an associate's degree through Bunker Hill Community College for a cohort of 21 men in the men's medium security prison in Concord. The Prison Initiative is now working to offer a bachelor's degree through Tufts with a major in civic studies in the School of Arts and Sciences. Our students want to have a positive impact on their communities while they're still incarcerated and as they release, and this major gives them the tools to do that. And the Tufts mission statement says that Tufts is dedicated to the creation and application of knowledge, providing transformative experiences for students and faculty in an inclusive and collaborative environment, and innovating in the face of complex challenges to distinguish students as active citizens of the world. So having heard this and having done education in prison and understanding the profound impacts that it can have on someone, how do you understand Tufts' mission statement or role in upholding that mission statement in that context and just the role of education in general?
I think that every university that seeks to try to better their community, that tries to equip young people to be successful, like you have to acknowledge the other population, right? You have to acknowledge the population of people who are there, part of your community as well, and they're deserving of education too. So what about them? I know my own experience with the Lipscomb community the small group of people who actually brought the program into the prison had to fight for it. They currently don't receive any funding from the actual university, but that would go a long way for a university to stand up and say, hey, we know that there's these conversations going on about reform and about reentry. We know that equipping people and giving them the tools that they need to succeed is good for all of society, not just these individuals, and we want to be a part of the solution. So we're going to actually go into the prisons and we're going to educate these people and we're going to help, we're going to do our part. I think that goes a long way, and I think it's absolutely in keeping with the mission statement. So the question is, how committed are they to that statement?
Hi, oh my gosh, it's so nice to see you here. I became completely engrossed in your story on Twitter about last year, and it's so amazing to see you here in person. And I just kind of wanted to know, historically, Black and brown bodies have been policed in a different way in America than other bodies, and there's a disproportionate amount of Black men and women who are in prison compared to white men and women. And I just wanted to know how you thought your experience was in the incarceration system, just the justice system as a woman of color, and how do you think that identity followed you throughout the process, and do you think it influenced the relationship you had with your attorneys or the judge, or just the system in general?
So I came to see that it wasn't just what race you are. It mattered whether you had the money to pay for justice. It mattered, who you knew, where you came from. There were so many different factors that were used to just degrade people and put them in a lower class. And so classes of individuals were denied justice. I saw that a lot. I saw that with a lot of the women, the Hispanic population there at the prison. They didn't get access to educational services. They were kind of just expected to learn English. They weren't given any kind of resources. They weren't given, translators for medical services. The list goes on and on. There were poor white women who came from situations, who had abusive husbands, who happened to be police officers, and their stories were never told, and they were given life sentences for defending themselves. And so I think, whether you're a woman, whether you're poor, there's so many different factors that are used to just, put people down and make them undeserving of justice. And that's unfortunate because everybody's life matters, everybody's voice matters. I mean, it's ridiculous. Justice is for all, not just for some, if you can afford it.
Hi. Thank you again so much for coming tonight and for sharing your story. In response to the earlier question that was asked about Tufts and its mission statement in upholding the mission statement in regards to the bachelor's degree at the Concord Prison in Massachusetts, we've been talking to students and faculty across the university to try and answer and figure out some of the questions or worries that they might have in doing this potential expansion of the program. And although the topics of inequality and achieving social change are brought up expansively in an abstract way in Tufts classes, many people we've spoken to worry about the ability of currently and formerly incarcerated people in matching the academic rigor of the university. Having worked as a teaching assistant at this program and with these students, I see firsthand that they often surpass what I or my non-incarcerated classmates can do, and in fact they do so with a greater appreciation and dedication to education than I see here. So with your own lived experience at the intersection of education and incarceration, how do you think the experiences of our students at the Concord campus and those who have similar stories and backgrounds would further their academic abilities as well as enrich the academic environment here? Thank you.
So I love what y'all are doing. I see what you're doing. Like you said, the professors would all say, they saw that we were working harder than some of the outside students. They did just enough to get by. A lot of them was I'm only doing this because my parents want me to do it. I feel like I have to do it. Really don't feel like school. Would rather party. But for those of us who have been denied it, and we had no kind of stimulation there in the prison, and this was just really our ticket to do something better, to do something more. A lot of the women in the program, they were the first ones in their family to have ever gone to college, to take college classes. They were always told that it wasn't for them. that, they weren't good enough for it. They couldn't afford it. It was never an option. So, you were that much more hungry for it. And what I found was that we could encourage the outside students, and the outside students had told us, like, wow, like I kind of just took this for granted. And the learning experience just from them going inside the prison, leaving outside of the classroom, having that real world experience, seeing things from beyond a textbook, from beyond a lecture, it was far more rewarding for them. And I mean, I love what you're doing. I would love if all of you could go out and advocate for the program, just how you're doing, continue speaking that truth, and continue calling it out.
Yes, wanted to thank you so much for sharing your testimony, and what an amazing story of breakthrough and the boldness and bravery that you do have, so thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask a question more of the systems of trafficking. So you mentioned that your trafficker wasn't arrested, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about the supply and demand of trafficking, given that it is a billion-dollar industry and there's a lot going on there and it operates like a business. So what are your suggestions, and what are you thinking about in terms of partnering with organizations or solutions to dismantle, the trafficker and from the top down? Like, what does that look like, and what are some ways that we can support and help in a way that we can decrease the demand and really work through the sexually broken world and seeing it restored?
Right. Well, you said a word when you said supply and demand. There's a lot of talk about, decriminalizing the buying of sex, and whenever it's open season like that, you're going to see even more people being motivated to exploit young girls, vulnerable populations. So it's definitely not supporting that. It's definitely not saying, well, we're not going to punish the people who are purchasing. No, they're part of the problem. Like you said, supply and demand. What a lot of people don't know is under federal statute, not only are people who encourage young girls to go out and sell their bodies, but the people who purchase young girls for sex are legally traffickers as well. So Johns, they're traffickers. So continuing to talk about that, educating people on that, that's something that I am personally committed to with the Glitter Project, which is the grassroots learning initiative on teen trafficking, exploitation, and rape. It's committed to dialogue that talks about that, because I saw a correlation between a lot of the things that we understand as normal and as okay, a lot of these social norms that I grew up with and that I see now, that contributed to my false understanding of what was all right for me as a young girl to do with men. That's a conversation we need to be having. We have movies that glorify the commodification of women's bodies. That's a conversation we need to have.
Is glitter Tennessee-based at this point, or can we talk about you're expanding it in some way? And
so it definitely is going to be expanded. We're actually working on that. And, glitter, it's the grassroots learning initiative. That means you can leave here tonight and you can talk to someone about something that you've learned. You can read this book and talk about something that you've learned to someone else. It's about educating one another, because that's the only way that we can change social norms. That's the only way that we can reprogram the understanding of what's okay in our society. I started the Glitter Project when I came across a study that said that 57% of mandated reporters thought that certain young girls choose to prostitute themselves. And if these individuals who are on the front line of defending young girls from being exploited think that that's a problem. That's an issue. So that's really what I would like to see change. And in order for that to change, we have to start talking about what the truth is. Great.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciated hearing your story. In the intro, they talked about how social media really made your story go viral. I wanted to know, how did it feel to get out and see your story being told through social media? What was the level of accuracy that your story was told, and how can we use social media in the future for advocacy work?
Good question. Social media isn't always like 1,000% accurate. I think we all know that. But for me, what was important was that there were people having the conversation. And it wasn't for me and about me personally, but I thought about all the young girls who are currently going through what I went through. I think about the women who are still in prison. People just forget about them and their experiences. The men who people just kind of write those experiences off. So whenever I saw someone talking about my own situation, I said, wow, yes, they're talking about them. They're shedding a light for them. So that has the potential to create change. But like I said, you have to take it a step further than just having that conversation. Like you have to ask the second question, which is, what can I do to help? And then actually do it. So for me, it was really promising and it was really hopeful. And, I really hope that a lot of the things that we see people going off about on social media when it comes to the system and when it comes to individuals' cases, it translates into changes in the law, to changes in the practices that can benefit the people who you don't necessarily see their names.
Last question?
I was going to follow up, but is there someone else I can't see out there? Oh, great.
Hi, I appreciate you being here so much. I've been following your story for like years, but I just I can't even imagine like the devastation that I would feel receiving a life sentence in prison. And I was just wondering, like, how did you not fall into a cycle of bitterness, and how did you not feel like giving up, and how did you turn this horrible situation into advocacy for yourself and other people?
That's a great question. It was devastating to hear. It was devastating to be told that my life was going to be over before I had ever had a driver's license. I had never been to a prom or homecoming, and all of a sudden they're telling me that my life is done. Completely devastating. But there was something in me that was just defiant, that said, I'm not about to allow these people to tell me that my life is over. I'm not done. I'm not done. I'm going to continue fighting, and I'm going to keep fighting. So it's definitely that resilience. And, that comes from the Lord. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the Lord pushing me on and keeping me going. But it was definitely Him, because when I look back, I can't tell y'all how I can sit here and be of sound mind and be able to just, not have that bitterness. It's nothing but Him and forgiveness.
You're very generous about the women. I mean, in your acknowledgments, you end by, you end with God, but before God, you name some of the people who were your community inside and who are still inside, I assume. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the complexity of freedom, given that.
Yeah. So for me, it's. A lot of people, when they talk about being free, when I was being incarcerated, they talk about what they were going to do and the things they wanted to do. For me, I felt, this sense of responsibility. And this is something that God has allowed me to do. He's put me in this position to help them, to shed a light. And so I feel like I'm carrying this. When you look at me, I want you to think of the other people who have been written off, who people think that, they've done this and they need to be sent away for X amount of years. There's nothing that can be done for them. No, God can turn anyone around. And these are people's mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and they could be sitting here having the same conversation with you just as I am. And so it's really just putting a face to them and a face to their experience, because I think a lot of times what we've seen is they've been demonized. They've been painted in the worst possible lights, and at the end of the day, they're people, just like me and you. If you ever get the opportunity to go in through the prison program, I highly advise it, because it will completely change your life. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased. I'm saying that because that's what I've been told time and time again by students who've come to the prison, by judges who've sat on appellate courts, by my own former district attorney. There's something that completely changes when you're able to put a face to someone and just really see the humanity in them.
Thank you so much, Cyntoia, for being here, for sharing your story with us, for your beautiful book, which thank everybody here for coming out, and I hope you will read Cyntoia's book. It's World, you were telling me.
It's World Book Day.
It's World Book Day, so it's a good day to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.